At dinner, my son Nathan looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're a nobody." But my mother-in-law isn't. I didn't respond. I just sat there quietly swallowing a lifetime of sacrifices he clearly no longer saw. 1 week later, he lost the house, the car, and every illusion he had about who really supported him. That same night, the woman he put on a pedestal, Victoria, suddenly stopped returning his calls. What happened after that wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. But it changed everything. The roast was still warm when I placed it in the center of the table, the aroma of garlic and rosemary filling the kitchen like a memory. I had spent the better part of the afternoon preparing dinner not because it was a holiday or a birthday, but because I missed having both my sons under one roof. Caleb had arrived early, offering to set the table, his smile as steady as ever. He had always been the calm one, the anchor, and I the quiet tide always moving around them, hoping my love reached far enough. Nathan, as usual, was late. When he finally walked through the door, the air changed. Not because he was loud. He wasn't. It was the way he carried himself now, like the world owed him something and he was done waiting politely. He barely looked at me when I greeted him. No hug, no, "Dinner smells great, Mom." Just a curt nod and a glance at his phone. Still, I smiled and asked him how work was going. He shrugged and muttered, "Busy." Caleb gave me a soft glance like he knew I was trying again. We sat down to eat the table looking fuller than it had in months. For a few fleeting minutes, it almost felt like old times. We talked about spring coming in early this year, how the lilacs were blooming already in the backyard. I mentioned the neighbor's new puppy. Caleb laughed and shared a story about a client who had locked herself in a bathroom during a virtual meeting. Nathan barely touched his food. He poked at the roast with his fork, the metal clinking against the plate like he was annoyed by its existence. I tried not to notice, tried not to take it personally, and then he put his fork down, loudly. "You know," he said, pushing his plate away, "it's actually embarrassing sometimes. Watching you pretend like any of this means something." I looked up slowly, confused. "What are you talking about, Nathan?" He leaned back in his chair, folded his arms. This whole sad little display. You're a nobody, Mom." "But my mother-in-law. Now that's a woman who understands success. She actually built something." My hands froze above my lap, still holding the napkin I'd been smoothing unconsciously. The room went very still, like even the light didn't know where to go. Caleb's chair scraped the floor. "Nathan." "What the hell?" Nathan didn't flinch. "It's true. Look at her. Margaret's still working part-time at the library, clipping coupons, cooking dinners, like it's 1985. Victoria, on the other hand, owns real estate across the state. She's respected. People listen when she talks." Caleb's face reddened. "Don't you dare talk to Mom like that. She's given up more than you'll ever understand." Nathan rolled his eyes. "Please, don't romanticize struggle. She chose this life. I've moved on. Maybe it's time I stop pretending. Maybe I should just call Victoria Mom from now on." He stood up, pushing his chair back so abruptly that it hit the wall behind him. I sat frozen, napkin clenched tightly in my hand. Caleb looked at me, his mouth slightly open, waiting for me to say something. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. Nathan walked out of the dining room without another word. The front door opened and shut with a dull thud like a punctuation mark at the end of something sacred. Caleb sat down slowly, the fire in his expression cooling to something more fragile. "Mom, I'm sorry." I shook my head and placed the napkin down, smoothing it carefully, like if I kept it neat enough this evening wouldn't feel so broken. "You don't have to apologize for him." He reached across the table, hand warm over mine. "You didn't deserve that. You never did." I nodded, still staring at the empty chair Nathan had left behind. When Caleb finally left an hour later after helping me clean the kitchen in silence, I stood alone in the dining room. The roast had gone cold. Plates sat on the counter, rinsed but not yet washed. The house was quiet again, like it had been for years before this evening. My eyes drifted to the wall just above the table, The old family photo we took at Lake McBride when the boys were 12 and 9. We were laughing in that picture. My husband had just thrown Caleb into the lake and Nathan was grinning ear to ear. I remembered how I had thought in that moment that everything would be okay as long as we stayed together. But we hadn't. Life had taken my husband first, and little by little it had taken Nathan too. He had always wanted more than I could give. And maybe somewhere along the way I let that make me smaller, more accommodating, more quiet. But tonight the silence didn't feel like strength. It felt like grief. I walked over to the photo and stared at the boys' faces, searching for something I could hold on to. Nathan had been such a loving child, sensitive. He used to cry when squirrels got hit on the road. He used to sneak out of bed to draw me pictures. He used to say, "You're the best mom in the world," just because I let him stay up late. Where had that boy gone? The more I looked at the picture, the more distant it felt, like a story someone else had told me, one I believed too easily. The clock ticked steadily in the kitchen and I realized I hadn't eaten. My appetite was gone. Instead, I poured myself a cup of tea, black, no sugar, and sat on the sofa in the living room. The mug warmed my hands, but it couldn't touch the chill that had taken root inside me. Nathan's words echoed over and over again. "You're a nobody. Victoria knows what success looks like. I'll call her Mom from now on." Each sentence landed like a small blow, not because they were true, but because they came from the one person I had sacrificed the most for. Not out of duty, but out of love. I had loved him through tantrums and teenage years, through college applications and heartbreaks, through every moment he doubted himself. I had worked double shifts to keep his apartment heated, skipped vacations to pay his tuition, quietly covered his failed business loan so it wouldn't ruin his credit. But none of that mattered now. Not to him. Victoria had bought his admiration with country club lunches and slick advice. And I had merely kept the lights on. I thought of calling him, of asking him what he meant, of demanding an apology, but I knew it would only lead to more hurt. So I didn't call. Instead, I sat in the quiet, the mug cooling in my hands, and I let myself feel the weight of 30 years. When the clock struck 10, I turned off the lights and walked upstairs to bed. But sleep didn't come easy that night, because something inside me had shifted. Something that used to bend no longer would. I didn't sleep much that night. I watched the shadows on my ceiling shift and lengthen until the pale light of dawn crept through the curtains. By the time the birds began their morning song, my thoughts had already made several loops through the past 30 years. None of them brought comfort. All of them led to the same question: where did I go wrong? The kitchen was still as I made my tea. I didn't bother turning on the radio like I usually did. The silence was easier to sit with now, less jarring, more honest. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug and leaned against the counter, my gaze drifting to the small corkboard by the fridge. It held a few yellowed grocery lists, a photo of Caleb and Nathan when they were kids, both of them covered in chocolate frosting from the birthday cake I made myself that year, and a fortune from a cookie that read, "Your quiet strength will carry you far." I had laughed when I first read it. Quiet strength. That had been my mantra, my method, my whole motherhood. But quiet strength, I was beginning to see, often meant invisible sacrifice. After Michael died, I didn't get the chance to fall apart. Nathan was 12, Caleb was 9, and the mortgage didn't care that I had just buried my husband. I picked up a second job shelving books at the town library at night. My days were spent answering phones at the county office, filing forms with paper cuts up and down my fingers. At night, I checked out mystery novels and helped elderly patrons find the latest large print edition of whatever they were reading. I was always tired, always aching, but I never said a word, because the boys needed stability and love and presence, and I was determined to give them all three even when I had none of that left for myself. Nathan struggled after high school. College hadn't been a good fit, but he tried, at least in the beginning. When he dropped out after a year and a half, he called me late at night, his voice already defensive. "It's not for me, Mom." You always said to follow our own paths. I had said that. I remembered. So I told him I understood. And when he said he needed a car to get to job interviews, I took out a small loan and surprised him with a used Toyota. He had barely looked at it. Just said, "Thanks, I guess. Victoria says I should dream bigger, that I should aim for a better lifestyle than used cars and office jobs." It stung, of course. But I didn't say anything. I smiled and nodded and reminded him to change the oil every 3,000 miles. That became the pattern. He'd need help. Money for rent support after another short-lived job, a loan to start a small business that never made it past the website stage. And I would find a way. Scrape from my savings delay repairs on the house, skip the new winter coat. He never asked twice because he never had to. And I never said no. When he was 25, he called during a snowstorm saying he needed a place to stay. He was behind on rent again. His credit was a mess. I told him he could come home, but he said I need space. I'm a grown man. And somehow that led to me dipping into my 401k to help him buy a small house in a modest neighborhood. The deed was in my name. His credit wouldn't allow anything else, but I let him move in and call it his own. He threw a housewarming party 2 weeks later. I wasn't invited. Caleb told me about it the next day. The realization that I was slowly being erased didn't hit all at once. It was like watching fog creep in. One moment I was front and center in his life. The next I was background noise. Convenient, expected, never mentioned, never thanked. And then came Victoria. She was everything I wasn't. Polished, wealthy, commanding. The kind of woman who hosted charity galas and never wore the same pair of heels twice. Nathan met her daughter at one of those fundraising events, and before long they were engaged. I met Victoria at the rehearsal dinner. She greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and a compliment that felt like a test. "You must be Margaret. I've heard some things." Then she turned her attention to the caterers. At the wedding, Nathan barely looked at me. He danced with his new mother-in-law twice, thanked her publicly during the toast, and left my name out altogether. Still, I smiled for the photos. Still, I sent a generous check as a gift. Still, I said nothing. Now, years later, I was no longer just forgotten. I was being actively replaced. Nathan spoke of Victoria with reverence, quoted her advice like gospel. She says I should focus on generational wealth. Victoria thinks I should look into real estate. Victoria says your generation never understood ambition. Once I tried to share a suggestion about budgeting when he mentioned he was low on cash. He cut me off mid-sentence. Mom Victoria says we shouldn't limit our thinking to scarcity. That mindset is old and useless. Old and useless. That's how he saw me now. Not the woman who stayed up all night sewing patches on his jeans. Not the mother who walked 2 miles to work in winter when the car broke down just so he could take the bus to school. Just someone from a different time. A leftover. I took my tea to the living room and sat by the window. The wind had picked up, scattering early spring blossoms across the lawn. I watched a leaf spin in a circle near the porch, caught in a small current it couldn't escape. That's what I felt like. A leaf caught in Nathan's orbit. Turning, twisting, always around him, but never landing anywhere. I had spent decades folding myself smaller, choosing peace, choosing patience, choosing to love him enough for the both of us. But maybe, just maybe, I had done him no favors by shielding him from the cost of my giving. Maybe it was time I stopped bending. The tea had gone cold in my hands, and I hadn't taken a sip. I set it down on the end table, the ceramic clinking softly against the wood. Out the window I saw the faint outline of Nathan's house on the next block. I had chosen that home myself. Picked it because it was near a good bus line, because it had a new roof and clean bones, because it felt safe. I remembered standing in the empty living room with him, pointing to the fireplace and saying, "You'll build memories here." But he hadn't. He had built distance, bit by bit. And I had let him. I pulled the blanket over my lap and leaned back in the chair. My reflection in the glass looked tired, but beneath the exhaustion something else was stirring. Not anger, not yet, but something close to clarity, Something steady. Something ready. The house was quiet that night, the kind of stillness that makes every sound feel louder. The ticking clock in the kitchen, the creak of old wood under the refrigerator, the wind brushing against the window pane like it was asking to be let in. I lay awake in bed, eyes open, staring at the dark ceiling, tracing the familiar outline of shadows I'd known for years. Sleep didn't come. Not after what Nathan had said. Not after the way he had looked at me, like I was nothing. At some point, I gave up trying. I pulled on a sweater and stepped out onto the back porch, letting the screen door close gently behind me. The air was cool for a spring night, the breeze carrying the faint smell of lilac and damp soil. I sat in the old rocking chair near the edge, the one Michael had sanded down years ago when the boys were still in grade school. It had been Caleb's favorite spot during summer evenings, when he'd sit with a book and let the night settle around him like a blanket. I rocked slowly, letting the rhythm soothe the ache that had taken residence in my chest. The stars were out in full above Cedar Rapids. They felt so far away, cold, indifferent. I used to look at them and feel wonder. Now I just felt small. My thoughts wandered uninvited through the long corridors of memory. Nathan, 17, standing in the kitchen, shoulders slumped, saying he needed help paying for community college. I had been washing dishes hands deep in sudsy water, and I remembered drying them quickly, hugging him before he could change his mind. Of course I had said we'll make it work. He never thanked me. Later, when the car broke down his sophomore year, he called me from the side of the road. "I can't get to class like this, Mom," he'd said. I left work early, paid for the tow, and drained my emergency fund to cover repairs. When he wanted to start his own landscaping business, he showed up on my doorstep with a printed brochure and a pitch. "It's my chance to be my own boss," he said. I co-signed the loan. He quit 6 months later. Each moment, each favor was a stone I had laid into the foundation of his adult life. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being a builder and became a crutch. He didn't see me as a person anymore. Just a safety net. Invisible until needed. And now, after everything he'd stood in my kitchen and told me I was nobody, that another woman had replaced me in his heart. I tightened the blanket around my shoulders and looked out at the yard. The flower beds needed weeding. The grass was patchy near the fence line. I had always kept the place up on my own, trimming hedges, painting shutters, patching the roof after a storm. The house didn't look fancy, but it stood strong. Just like I had. So why did I feel so hollow? I thought of something I hadn't dared ask myself until that moment. If my son didn't want me as a mother anymore, was I still obligated to keep mothering him? The question sat heavy in the air. I didn't have an answer, not yet. But I knew the rules had changed. The balance of our relationship had tipped too far, and I was the only one feeling the weight. I stayed on the porch until the sky began to pale. Birds stirred in the branches, and the neighborhood woke slowly, one window at a time. When I came inside, the kitchen clock read 6:12 a.m. I poured myself another cup of tea, no sugar, and stood at the table without drinking it. Then I opened the file drawer in the hallway. It was old and overstuffed. Receipts, warranties, utility bills from 5 years ago. But somewhere in there, I knew I'd find what I needed. It took a while, but I found the manila envelope marked Nathan. Inside were documents I had once guarded like treasure. The car registration, my name, the insurance policy, my payments month after month, then the house, the mortgage contract, the deed, all signed by me, all paid for by me. Nathan had never made a single full payment. I had always told myself it was temporary, that once he got stable, he'd take over. But stability never came, and I never pushed. Until now. I spread the papers across the dining table, smoothing them with my palms. Facts, proof. No more emotions, no more guilt. Just cold ink on legal paper. Ownership responsibility decision. I walked to the kitchen drawer, the one where I kept spare keys. There, buried under old batteries and rubber bands, was the key to the Honda Civic I had given Nathan. Still had the little tag on it that said, "Love you, Mom." I picked it up, ran my thumb over the faded ink, and felt something shift. It wasn't anger. It was something calmer, firmer. Resolve. I tucked the key into my pocket and returned to the table. I collected the documents, stacked them neatly, slid them back into the envelope. Then I placed the envelope on the hall table by the front door. I didn't need to look at them anymore. I already knew the truth. Tomorrow I would go see him. Tomorrow I would take back what was mine. But tonight I would sleep. Not because I had found peace, but because I had found direction. And that for the first time in years was enough. The morning was crisp with that early spring chill that clings to the edge of the wind. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft golden hue across the quiet streets of Cedar Rapids. I hadn't slept much, but for the first time in a long while, I felt awake in a different way. Focused. Anchored. I had made up my mind the night before, and once I make up my mind, I don't stall. I pulled into Nathan's driveway just past 7. His house looked the same as always. Slightly unkempt. The lawn patchy, a couple of recycling bins tipped over near the garage. The curtains were still drawn. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment, letting the silence settle. My fingers grazed the envelope beside me, the one holding the registration and title of the car. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about anger. This was about boundaries, something I had neglected for far too long. I stepped out of the car, my shoes crunching lightly on the gravel path. I walked up to the front door and knocked. 3 firm raps, no hesitation. From inside I heard shuffling, then a pause, the sound of a lock turning. Nathan opened the door, groggy shirt, wrinkled hair, tousled like he hadn't been up long. His face twisted in confusion. "Mom, what are you doing here?" I didn't smile. "I didn't ask to come in. I'm here for the car keys," I said plainly. "Hand them over." He blinked, then rubbed his face. "Wait, what? Are you serious?" "I'm completely serious," I said, holding his gaze. "I want the keys to the Civic. Now." He laughed, that familiar scoff that always came out when he felt challenged. "Mom, that's my car. You gave it to me." I let you use it," I corrected. I reached into my bag and pulled out the registration. "It's registered in my name. The insurance is under my policy. The loan is under my credit. I've paid every repair, every oil change, every tire. It's not a gift, Nathan. It's mine." He stepped back slightly, the disbelief turning to irritation. "You've got to be kidding. You're pulling this stunt now. Over what?" Because I was honest at dinner, my jaw clenched, but I kept my voice even. "This has nothing to do with dinner. It has to do with a pattern that's gone too far. I'm not here to argue. I'm not here to justify. I'm here to reclaim what's mine." He shook his head, muttering something under his breath. Then he raised his voice sharper now. "This is ridiculous, Mom. You don't just show up and take back a car like some repo agent. What is wrong with you?" I didn't flinch. "What's wrong is that I've spent over a decade funding your adulthood while you've treated me like an afterthought. I won't do it anymore. So please, the keys." He crossed his arms. "You know Victoria would never—" I raised a hand. "Stop right there. I'm not interested in what Victoria would or wouldn't do. This is between you and me. Don't bring her into this." We stood there in silence for a moment. Behind him I could see the front hallway. The same one I had helped paint when he first moved in. The walls were scuffed now, clutter lining the floor. A forgotten Amazon box leaned against a shoe rack. Eventually he sighed and turned back inside. A minute later he returned with the keys dangling from his hand. He slapped them into my palm harder than necessary. "Take it," he said bitterly. "Hope it makes you feel powerful." I didn't respond. I tucked the keys into my coat pocket and turned to leave. "By the way he called after me, I guess this is your way of saying you're done being a mother, huh?" I stopped at the edge of the porch, then turned just slightly. "No, Nathan. This is my way of saying I finally remembered how—" And with that I walked to the car. The drive to the bank was quiet, steady. The Civic drove just as smoothly as I remembered, though it still had that faint rattle under the dash from the last winter's cold snap. I'd told him twice to have it looked at. He never did. Downtown was still waking up when I arrived. I parked in front of the small credit union on 3rd Street, the same one I'd used for years. I sat in the car for a moment watching the employees open blinds and flip the open sign. Then I grabbed my folder, stepped out, and walked inside. The interior was warm familiar. Soft jazz played from ceiling speakers. The teller greeted me with a polite smile. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you?" "I need to cancel an automatic payment," I said. "It's tied to a property mortgage. I have the documents here." She led me to her desk and I handed over the folder. As she typed my account number into the system, I looked around the lobby. Everything was neat, intentional, just like how I'd tried to run my home. The woman glanced at the screen, then back at me. "I see the account. This mortgage has been active for nearly 5 years, correct?" "That's right. Are you selling the property?" "No," I said. "I'm terminating support for the occupant. The financial arrangement has changed." She nodded, not pressing further. "We can cancel the auto draft and convert it to manual payments. You'll receive a final confirmation in the mail. Please do that." She printed a form and slid it toward me. I read every word. Then I signed. It felt small, just ink on paper. But to me it was a declaration. I wasn't just cutting off a payment, I was ending a cycle. "Thank you," I said, folding the receipt into my purse. "You're welcome. If there's anything else." "No," I said gently. "This is enough for today." I walked back outside. The morning sun had risen fully now, bathing the sidewalk in gold. The wind was warmer, softer. As I stood for a moment on the steps, I let the light hit my face. It felt like a reset, a quiet line drawn in the sand. I wasn't angry. I wasn't heartbroken. I was finally absolutely done. It didn't take long. By noon the next day, my phone rang. The screen lit up with Nathan's name flashing like an alarm bell I had long ignored. I let it buzz once, twice, and then answered, keeping my voice steady. "Hello?" His voice exploded through the speaker. "Mom, what the hell? I just got off the phone with the bank. They said the mortgage payment stopped. Are you evicting me?" I took a breath, walked to the kitchen window, and looked out over the backyard. The lilac bushes were blooming early this year. Fitting, I thought, for a season of unexpected change. "I'm not evicting you, Nathan," I said. "I'm reclaiming my home." That's the same thing he shouted. "You're throwing me out." I didn't flinch. "It's my house. You were never a tenant, Nathan. You never signed a lease. You've never made a payment. You were someone I allowed to stay. That permission has ended." There was silence for a second, like he couldn't believe I had spoken the words aloud. And then it came that scoffing bitterness again. "This is insane. You're being petty because of what I said at dinner." "No," I replied calmly. "I'm being clear because of how you've treated me for years." He tried to talk over me. "You can't just do this. I live here, my things are here, I have a life." "Then it's time you take responsibility for it," I said, and ended the call. The phone barely had time to cool in my hand before it buzzed again. This time a message from Caleb. "Hey Mom, just got off the phone with Nathan. He's freaking out. Says he's talking to Victoria. Apparently she told him she's going to handle you. Her words, not mine. Thought you should know." I read the message twice, letting the words sink in. Victoria. Of course. She'd probably been in his ear since last night, spinning her version of the truth. In her world, I was the overbearing, outdated mother who couldn't let go, the stubborn woman who was holding her ambitious son back. It made my skin prickle, not with fear, but with a cold, calculating awareness. Let them try, I thought. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I placed the phone on the counter and walked to the hallway closet. At the bottom, behind some unused candles and a rolled-up rug I kept meaning to donate, was a small metal box. I pulled it out and carried it to the dining table. Inside was every property document I had ever saved. Deeds, payment histories, tax assessments, insurance policies. I had kept everything, not because I planned to use it, but because I believed in being prepared. I laid the documents out one by one. The deed to the house Nathan lived in, the proof of ownership, every mortgage payment made under my name. I organized them by year, clipped them neatly, and placed them in a new folder. Then I pulled out a separate envelope with the title to the car. Just a few days ago, he was driving that car, thinking of it as his. And now it was parked in my driveway where it belonged. That shift, that reclaiming had triggered something in me. Something I couldn't unsee. The realization that every act of generosity, when left unacknowledged, eventually rots into resentment. I wasn't resentful yet, but I had no intention of walking that path. If Nathan wanted to bring Victoria into this, if she wanted to play legal games, I was ready. I had built my entire life on stability, organization, and quiet strength. They wanted a fight, fine, but they wouldn't like the battlefield I chose. I called my lawyer, Grant Turner, and scheduled a meeting for the next day. Grant had helped me years ago when I refinanced my own home. A sharp, reasonable man who didn't waste time on drama. I didn't plan to sue anyone. But I would make sure every inch of legal ground beneath me was solid. As I made a list of the items I needed to bring, copies of the mortgage email records, tax forms, I remembered something Nathan had said a few months ago. We were on the phone and he had mentioned something about refinancing the house. He'd said, "Victoria thinks I should take out equity and invest it." I had laughed nervously at the time, unsure whether he was serious. Now it was clear. They thought of the house as theirs, as potential, as leverage, but it had never been theirs to begin with, and now it never would be. I opened the laptop on the kitchen table and pulled up my email account. I searched for keywords, Nathan transfer payment, Victoria. What emerged was a quiet paper trail. Conversations where Nathan had promised to take over payments, messages where I sent him confirmation receipts. One email stood out. It was from him, dated 2 years ago. "Thanks for covering last month, Mom. I'll catch up as soon as I land that new contract. Victoria says it's just a matter of time." He never caught up. I printed it anyway. The file folder was thick by the time I zipped it shut and returned it to the hallway table. That evening, I made a simple dinner. Grilled cheese and tomato soup. I ate in silence, watching the sun dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the floor. I thought about Nathan, about Victoria, about how quickly someone could rewrite history if they were charming enough, persuasive enough. But the paper didn't lie. The documents didn't forget, and neither did I. Later that night, as I sipped a cup of tea in the living room, the phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail from an unknown number. I pressed play. It was Victoria. Her voice was clipped formal, as if rehearsed. "Margaret, I think it's time we had a conversation. I understand there's been some confusion about the arrangements regarding Nathan. He's very upset. We're all trying to stay calm here, but I would hate to see this escalate unnecessarily. Let's talk like women of reason." I deleted the message. No return call, no conversation. There was nothing more to clarify. I finished my tea and walked upstairs, the soft creak of the steps reminding me that this house, my house, was built on more than wood and nails. It was built on years of sacrifice, of presence of love offered without condition. But conditions had a way of changing. That night, as I tucked the folder into my tote bag and placed it by the front door, I didn't feel vindictive. I felt prepared, ready, because sometimes being a good mother means drawing a line, and this time the line would be permanent. The next morning, I pulled into the small parking lot outside Grant Turner's law office, a red brick building tucked between a bakery and a florist on Main Street. It was just after 8, but the lights were already on, and a young assistant was unlocking the door with a to-go coffee in hand. Inside, everything was as I remembered from years ago. Tidy, efficient, no frills. Grant had never been one for dramatic gestures. He was the kind of man who wore a simple watch, kept every file alphabetized, and had a quiet confidence that made people lean in when he spoke. I had trusted him once to help me refinance my house after Michael passed. Now I was trusting him again, but for a different reason. He came out to greet me himself. "Margaret," he said, extending his hand, "you're looking well." "Looks can be deceiving," I replied, managing a small smile. He nodded, ushered me into his office, and gestured for me to sit. "I understand you brought documents." I handed him the folder I'd spent the past 2 days assembling. As he flipped through the pages, his brow creased in thought, not concern. "I need to know what I'm standing on," I said. "Nathan's threatening to push back legally, and there's someone behind him, his mother-in-law, Victoria Palmer." He paused at the name, then looked up at me. "The one with the string of real estate holdings and a reputation for making things complicated." "That's the one." He continued reviewing the deed, the mortgage records, the signed car title, the printed emails. "Well, the good news is you're on solid ground. The house is yours. The car is yours. You have a paper trail that clearly shows you've carried the financial weight all along. There's no lease, no agreement of tenancy, and no documentation that would make Nathan anything more than a guest." "Can they sue anyway?" I asked. He leaned back slightly, lacing his fingers together. "They can always try. But they don't have much to stand on. If they push for emotional damages or try to paint you as manipulative, it won't hold, especially given this documentation. The only risk I see is if Victoria tries to muddy the waters by bringing in her own influence, financial or otherwise." I nodded slowly. She's already planting ideas in his head. He's parroting her words, acting like I robbed him of his legacy, when in reality she's been the one encouraging him to lean harder on me while painting me as the problem. Grant's eyes sharpened. "Has she ever involved herself in your finances directly?" "Not on paper. But I suspect she's helped Nathan financially, or at least advised him, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of it was to undermine my role." He tapped a pen against the desk. "Victoria Palmer's name came across my radar once before. A client of mine had dealings with one of her shell companies. Tsing. There were whispers of tax irregularities. Nothing confirmed, but enough smoke to suggest fire. That got my attention." "What kind of irregularities?" "Inflated deductions. Real estate losses that didn't align with actual market conditions. Possibly some creative asset hiding." My heart thudded, not out of fear, but clarity. If she's vulnerable there, "You could report it," he said carefully. "It wouldn't be retaliation. It would be a legal avenue if you have reason to believe she's committing fraud. And it would certainly shift the balance if she's backing Nathan with questionable funds." He slid a business card across the desk. "If you want to pursue that route, I'd recommend you speak with someone who understands tax law better than I do. Emily Carter. She's sharp, has an eye for red flags, and she works discreetly." "Carter," I said. "Is she local 3 blocks over? Tell her I sent you." By the time I left Grant's office, the bakery next door had just opened, and the smell of fresh cinnamon rolls hit me like a memory. I almost walked in. Almost. But I had other things to do first. Emily Carter's office was small and nondescript, just a frosted glass door with her name etched in gold script. She welcomed me with a warm smile and a calm presence that reminded me a little of myself back when I still worked the library desk during long evenings. "Grant mentioned you'd be coming," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "Let's see what we're working with." I handed her a second folder, this one filled with screenshots, email references, and public financial filings I had found online. Victoria's company names, property reports, even LinkedIn blurbs where she boasted about offshore investment strategies. I wasn't sure how much of it mattered, but I had learned over the years paper doesn't lie. Emily adjusted her glasses and began scanning the pages. Her fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, pulling up databases and cross-checking company listings. After several quiet minutes, she let out a soft hum. "There's definitely some smoke here," she said. "This real estate trust. It's registered in Delaware, which is legal but often used for asset protection. She's claimed consistent losses for the past 4 years while simultaneously expanding her portfolio. That doesn't add up." "Could it be a mistake?" I asked. "Possibly," she said, "but unlikely. This looks deliberate. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are inconsistencies in her personal returns as well. If she's funding Nathan using unreported income, or if her companies are writing off personal gifts as business expenses, that's IRS territory. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Not because of fear, but because it confirmed what I had suspected all along. Victoria wasn't just overstepping emotionally. Amazing. She was playing a financial game with rules she thought didn't apply to her. "What are my options?" I asked quietly. "You can file a report. It can be anonymous." "The IRS has a dedicated whistleblower portal. If what you're showing me holds up under review, she could face audits, fines, possibly even fraud investigations." I nodded. "And there's no way this comes back to me." "There's always risk," she said. "But if you stay anonymous and submit through the proper channels, it's minimal. And based on what I see here, you wouldn't be doing it out of spite. You'd be reporting a legitimate concern." We spent the next hour gathering everything into a formal packet. Emily formatted the documents, added summaries of her findings, and guided me through the IRS reporting system. I created an anonymous email account for follow-ups and wrote a brief statement of suspicion, careful to stick to facts. When we were done, she printed a confirmation page and handed it to me. "It's submitted," she said. "Now we wait." I folded the confirmation neatly and slid it into my purse. The weight of the morning settled into my shoulders. Not heavy, but solid, grounding. I had spent so many years waiting, hoping things would get better on their own. But nothing gets better if you don't take your hands off your lap and reach for the wheel. As I stepped out onto the street, the wind had picked up. Clouds were moving in fast and low, the kind that promise rain before dinner. I tightened my coat and walked back to my car with steady steps. No one had to know what I had done that day, but soon enough they'd feel it. It was just past 3 when my phone rang. I was in the kitchen drying dishes from lunch, the window cracked open to let in the soft breeze. Spring had settled in properly now, gentle, fragrant quiet. The kind of afternoon where you might lose time staring out at the tulips along the fence line, wondering how they always find their way back even after the hardest frost. The screen lit up with an unfamiliar number, but something in me already knew. I wiped my hands, picked up the phone, and answered without hesitation. Margaret speaking. There was a pause on the other end, a deliberate one. And then a voice smooth as glass but sharp beneath the surface. "Margaret, this is Victoria Palmer." I said nothing. Let the silence speak first. I trust you're aware things have escalated. Still, I didn't say anything. She sighed as if disappointed. "I think it's time we spoke, woman to woman." I stepped away from the sink, leaning against the counter. "Go on. There's been a lot of emotion flying around lately. Nathan is distraught. You've taken his car. You've frozen the mortgage. He's unstable. And now, well, he tells me you're preparing legal maneuvers." I didn't confirm or deny. I waited. She continued, her tone dipping into something rehearsed. "Look, Margaret, I get it. It's difficult being left behind, watching your son build a new life, one that doesn't revolve around you. But there's a difference between protecting your dignity and clinging to control. And frankly, it's not a good look for a woman your age to behave like this." I smiled. Not out of amusement, but because I had been waiting for that line. That condescension disguised as concern. That false politeness laced with superiority. I walked to the dining table and sat down, phone still to my ear. "You raised your daughter well, Victoria," I said quietly. "She married a man who doesn't know how to say thank you. And she learned from you how to look down without ever appearing to bend her neck." She stiffened on the other end. "Excuse me," I said, I continued voice, "even that I'm done letting you define what motherhood looks like in my family. I raised my sons with integrity. I gave them more than I had. And now I'm fixing what you broke in Nathan." There was a pause. I imagined her in some pristine office staring out over a skyline lipstick. Perfect hands clenched tighter than her tone. "I didn't break him," she said coldly. "I gave him perspective. I gave him ambition. No, I said. You gave him entitlement. You handed him applause without effort, shortcuts without foundation. You let him believe that admiration could be bought, and I let him believe that love came without limits. But those days are over. Her tone shifted again, less polished, more brittle. You're jealous. I let out a breath. Of what? Of me. Of what I've built. The influence I have. Nathan trusts me. He listens to me. And it drives you mad that your own son sees someone else as the voice of wisdom. I laughed softly, not mocking, just tired. I don't want your status, Victoria. I don't want the cocktail parties, the curated smiles, or the power games you've turned into an art. I want something far simpler. Oh, I want my son to earn his name back. She was silent. I want him to remember what it means to work for something, to be grounded, to stand on his own without leaning on the nearest glamorous hand. Her voice returned sharper this time. If you keep pushing, this will get messy. Nathan is speaking to attorneys. You've overstepped. He has rights too, you know. No, he has habits, I said. Habits I enabled. But he's 30 years old. The world doesn't owe him comfort, and neither do I. You're making a mistake, she snapped. You're going to lose him completely. Then he was never mine to lose. I answered, and maybe it's time he learns what absence really feels like. The line went quiet. I could hear her breathing. Short, controlled, furious. Why? I imagined her manicured fingers tightening around the phone, debating whether to end the call with another threat or a parting insult. But I wasn't waiting for either. I have to go now, I said calmly. Enjoy your afternoon. And I hung up. I placed the phone down on the table, hand steady. No rage, no shaking, just stillness. A quiet pulse of clarity that filled the space around me. For years I had let women like Victoria shape the narrative, subtly, relentlessly, always suggesting that I was somehow less accomplished, less elegant, less worthy. But they didn't know what strength looked like when it wasn't on display. They didn't know what sacrifice felt like when it wasn't announced. I rose from the table and walked to the living room where the light slanted across the floor in long, golden lines. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves stirred on the porch. I didn't feel like a woman who had lost control. I felt like a woman who had finally taken it back. And there wasn't a single thing Victoria could say that would change that. The notice arrived on a Wednesday. I knew it had been mailed because I received the carbon copy first. The official language printed across the top of the envelope in bold, impersonal ink, Notice of Foreclosure Proceedings. Nathan's name appeared nowhere on it, of course. Every line, every number, every signature was mine. Because the house had always been mine. I had just allowed someone else to live in it. I placed the letter on the kitchen counter alongside the others I'd been quietly collecting. Confirmation of the car title transfer, the email from the bank stating the cancellation of automatic payments, the receipt of my IRS submission. It all sat there in a neat row, not as trophies, but as evidence of a new kind of truth. One I had waited too long to live in. By Friday, the fallout began. Caleb texted me around noon. Just 2 words. He knows. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I had anticipated this part. The outrage, the panic, the disbelief. It always came after the silence. After the woman who never said no finally did. When the phone rang an hour later, I recognized Nathan's number instantly. I let it ring until the final second before picking up. Mom, he said, his voice strained, cracking at the edges. I got the letter. The foreclosure notice. What is this? You can't do this. I stayed quiet for a moment. Then I already did. He exhaled hard like he'd been punched. They're going to kick me out. I don't know where I'm supposed to go. You knew this was coming, Nathan. I warned you. You warned me by taking my car and freezing my life. What kind of mother does that? The kind who spent the last decade keeping the roof over your head while you blamed her for the rain. He didn't answer right away. I heard him sniffle a muffled breath. When he spoke again, the anger was gone. What replaced it was worse. Shame. Please, Mom, he said quietly this time. Don't let me end up on the street. I know I've messed up. I know I've said things. I was wrong. But this is too far. I walked over to the window, looked out at the small patch of grass I had mowed myself just the day before. The world always looked so ordinary while someone else's life unraveled. I'm not trying to punish you, I said. I'm trying to make you stand up. You're trying to break me. No, Nathan, life will do that on its own. I'm trying to make sure you're strong enough when it does. There was a long pause. I imagined him sitting on the floor of that house, my house, surrounded by boxes half-packed, maybe still in denial, maybe waiting for someone to show up and say it was all a mistake. You always said you'd be there, he whispered, and I said, more than I should have been. Another silence. He tried again, this time with a trembling edge. I talked to Victoria. She says she can float me alone, but she's not really answering my calls anymore. I let that sit in the air between us. It was unraveling, all of it. Victoria, who had once walked into our lives with her expensive perfume and endless confidence, now had problems of her own. I had heard the whispers through local networks. The audit had begun. Her company's financials were being pulled apart by people much less forgiving than me. And Nathan, once so eager to quote her, was realizing that admiration built on image had no roots. Mom, he said again, desperation peeking through. Please, just one more time. Help me get through this. I swear I'll change. I'll start over. I'll listen. I didn't doubt his fear. I didn't even doubt his tears. But what I did doubt, what I had learned to question, was whether change born from crisis ever lasted once the crisis passed. Nathan, I said gently, you've leaned long enough, son. He didn't say anything. It's time to walk on your own. A choked breath came through the line. Then silence. Then the sound of him ending the call. I stood there for a while, the phone still in my hand, the dial tone humming softly into the quiet room. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't sad, but because I had already grieved this part. The letting go wasn't sudden. It had been happening silently for years. This was just the final page turning. Later that afternoon, I drove by the house. I didn't park. I didn't knock. I slowed near the curb just long enough to see the moving truck parked in the driveway, its back open like a mouth ready to swallow every piece of comfort Nathan had once taken for granted. He stood near the porch, directing the movers with slumped shoulders, a cardboard box in his arms. I couldn't see his face, but his posture said everything. Not defiance, not rage, just exhaustion. The lawn hadn't been mowed in weeks. Weeds crept through the sidewalk cracks. The front steps were chipped paint peeling where he'd never bothered to touch it up. I had built that house with hope. He had lived in it with assumption. I kept driving. Back home, I placed my keys on the counter and made myself a cup of tea, the same way I had every afternoon since the day Michael died, not out of routine, but as a small act of stability, of presence. When the phone buzzed again, I didn't rush to answer. I waited. Let the call go to voicemail. Then I listened. It was Nathan. Mom, it's me. I don't know where to go. Dylan's parents won't let us stay with them. Victoria. She's not even returning texts now. I don't have anything left. I know I messed it up. I know I said things I shouldn't have. But I don't know how to fix it. Please, just this once, help me. I swear I'll be better. I closed my eyes. Just this once. The phrase I had heard so many times before. Just this once for the car. Just this once for rent. Just this once for the loan. The truth was, it had never been once. It had been my whole life. I set the phone down without replying. I didn't block him. I didn't erase the message. I just let it be. Like the past. Like the house. Like the pieces of myself I had given too freely. That evening I sat on the porch with my tea and watched the sky turn pink at the edges. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a mother desperately trying to hold on. I felt like a woman who had finally stepped back into her own life, and that I realized was its own kind of love. It was nearly 8 when I heard the knock at the door. Not a frantic pounding like the last time, not sharp or demanding. Just 3 quiet knocks. Deliberate, uncertain. I was in the kitchen rinsing out my teacup from dinner, and for a moment I thought I might have imagined it, but then it came again softer this time. I dried my hands, slowly, walked to the front door, and peered through the window. Nathan stood on the porch. He was wearing a coat too thin for the weather collar turned up against the cool night air. His hair was messy, and he looked like he hadn't slept much in days. In his hands, folded neatly, was a single envelope. When I opened the door, I didn't say anything. I just stepped aside. He walked in slowly, hesitating like he wasn't sure if he should be there. The living room was dim, just the soft glow from the side lamp casting shadows on the old wooden floor. He stood near the fireplace, still holding the envelope. "I didn't want to text," he said. "Didn't think that was right." I nodded once but said nothing. He took a breath. "I wrote this," he said, holding out the envelope. "I wasn't sure I'd have the guts to say it out loud, but I think I need to." I took the letter but didn't open it, just held it in my hand as I sat down on the armchair by the window. He stayed standing, eyes darting to the picture frames on the mantel, photos from years ago, ones he hadn't looked at in a long time. "I've been sleeping on a friend's couch," he said. "The one who owed me a favor from way back. I haven't talked to Victoria since everything started unraveling. She's not who I thought she was. Or maybe she is, and I was just too stupid to see it." I listened, not coldly but quietly. He kept going. "I don't know when it happened, but somewhere along the way I convinced myself that money and success and flash meant something. I thought that if I could just be around it long enough, it would make me someone important, that I'd finally be someone people respected." His voice cracked a little. "But I forgot who actually showed up. Who actually stayed. I didn't even see it until I had nothing left and no one else picked up the phone." He paused. I could see the shame all over him like a coat he couldn't shrug off. "I treated you like a backup plan," he said. "Worse than that, I treated you like an obligation. And you were the one person who never asked for anything in return. Not once." My grip tightened around the envelope, not out of anger, but because I knew what it had cost him to admit that. "I can't take back what I said," he added. "I can't erase how I made you feel. I don't expect you to forgive me tonight. I want you to know I see it now. I see you." Still, I didn't cry. I didn't rush to hug him or fill the silence with warmth. Instead, I stood, walked over to him, and looked him in the eye. "Let's see what you do next," I said. His shoulders dropped, not in defeat, but in relief, like he'd been holding his breath for days and finally remembered how to exhale. He nodded. "Fair enough." Just then the front door opened, and Caleb stepped in carrying a paper bag. He stopped when he saw us. His eyes flicked from Nathan to me, and something softened in his face. "I figured you hadn't eaten," he said, holding up the bag. "Thought I'd bring over some sandwiches." Nathan let out a quiet laugh and rubbed the back of his neck. "Hey, Caleb." Caleb smiled, but it wasn't forced. "Hey, man." We moved into the kitchen without much talk. I set the table with 3 plates, simple glasses, and the sandwiches Caleb had brought, turkey and cheddar still warm from the deli down the road. I added a bowl of leftover potato salad from the fridge. No one commented on the menu. It wasn't about the food. For the first time in months, maybe longer, we sat together. No speeches, no expectations, just 3 people sharing a meal. Nathan didn't eat much, but he sat up straight, listened when Caleb spoke, asked about his job, even cracked a small joke about the squeaky chair he used to fix, but never did. Caleb laughed. I smiled. The air felt lighter. When dinner ended, Caleb stood and gathered the plates. Nathan offered to help, and for once I didn't wave him off. He rinsed the dishes in silence, standing exactly where I had stood so many nights when he was young. Elbows resting on the sink edge, forehead furrowed in thought. I watched him from the doorway, remembering the little boy who used to sit on the counter and swing his legs while I cooked. After everything, that boy was still in there somewhere. Not the same, older, bruised by pride, but maybe finally growing. Later, as Caleb prepared to leave, he hugged me. "That was good," he whispered. "Really good." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Nathan lingered near the door. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. "Early. I want to talk about work. Maybe see if I can start doing things right." I met his gaze. "I'll be here." When the door closed behind him, I stood for a long moment in the quiet. The letter he had given me still sat unopened on the side table. I didn't need to read it. I had already heard the truth in his voice. That night I didn't stay up with worry or guilt. I went to bed knowing that love didn't always have to be soft. Sometimes it had to be steady. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone you love is stop catching them, so they can learn how to land on their own. It was a clear morning when Nathan showed up again. No tears, no dramatics. Just a quiet knock on the back door, the one that led in from the garden. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the newspaper folded neatly beside me. When I opened the door, he stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, eyes clear and focused. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. I nodded and stepped aside. He didn't sit right away. He paced for a second, then pulled a folded paper from his back pocket and laid it on the table. A printed resume. At the top, a position with a local landscaping crew starting Monday. "I took the job," he said. "It's not glamorous, but it's mine." I read over the listing, then looked up at him. "I don't need a pat on the back," he said. I'm trying to earn what I didn't before." I sat back in my chair, the morning sun spilling through the window, warming the space between us. "And the house?" I asked. "I'd like to rent it," he replied, voice steady. "Market rate. I can start with a short-term lease. Nothing assumed. Just, if that's on the table." I didn't answer right away. I took a sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle through me. It wasn't about being tough. It was about setting terms that honored both of us. "If you want to rent it," I said, "you'll sign a lease, pay utilities, maintain the yard, no deferments, no excuses." He nodded. "Deal." "And you'll pay a security deposit," I added. That made him smile a little. Of course. There was no trace of the man who once quoted Victoria's financial advice like scripture. No mention of her, no complaints, just quiet ownership. Maybe the fall had grounded him, and maybe finally he wanted to stand without leaning. I handed him a blank lease template from my file drawer. "You fill it out, I'll review it." He took it gently, folded it in half, and slipped it into his bag. As he turned to go, he paused by the door. "I still have a long way to go," he said, "but I want you to know I'm trying. For real this time." I met his eyes. "I know." That afternoon, Caleb stopped by. He had a bag of groceries in hand and a spring in his step. He set the bag on the counter and gave me a quick hug. "I ran into Nathan on his way out," he said. "Looks like he's turning a corner. He's starting a job next week," I said. "And he asked to rent the house properly." Caleb's eyebrows rose. "He offered to pay rent. Now that's a plot twist." We both laughed, but it wasn't mocking. It was light surprised, grateful. Caleb leaned against the counter, arms crossed, looking at me with that same expression he'd had as a boy when he was proud of something, but didn't want to make a big deal about it. "You know," he said softly, "you didn't just take back the car or the house." I tilted my head. "You took back your worth, Mom." My eyes welled just for a second. I didn't let the tears fall, just let the truth of it settle where it needed to. That night I made dinner for myself. Nothing fancy. A baked potato, steamed green beans, a slice of leftover chicken. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet, the space, the way the house now felt like mine again. Not because Nathan was gone, but because I had chosen to stop disappearing inside my own life. After dinner, I washed the dishes and stepped out onto the back porch. The stars were out again, crisp against the dark. The air was cool, but not bitter. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and eased into the rocking chair, letting the old wood creak beneath me. The yard was still, the world calm. I looked up at the sky, remembering that night not so long ago when I sat here feeling invisible. How far away I had felt from myself, from the woman I used to be, the one who used to build things, homes, lives, boys into men. And I realized something. I hadn't lost her. She'd just gone quiet. She had waited patiently for me to remember, and I had. I closed my eyes for a moment, the stars behind my lids still shimmering. Then I whispered, not for anyone else, just for me. I stayed silent that night. But I finally spoke by living, and that I knew was more than enough.